Hello and welcome everybody to this early morning session of the NOvation Forum. Today we have, or in this session, we have 4 speakers, and the organization will be that each speaker will now have 20 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion at the end, and we really must also finish on time because then there will be a break and then there'll be the next session. So we really have to finish within the 2-hour time slot. And so without further ado, I'll start the session. My name is Cornelius Schubert. I'm a professor for the Sociology of Science and Technology at Technical University in Dortmund. I'll be leading through the session and moderating the questions later. I'll keep a strict time schedule. And with that, I'm very happy to welcome our first presenter, who will be Samuele Mortinu, and his talk will be on the importance of imagination for the greater, in brackets, innovative good. Samuele, you have the floor.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Let me share my screen. Okay, probably you should see my presentation now.
We see the presenter view.
Okay. Okay, so shall I start, right?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you so much for for the invitation to the organizer, and especially to Lucien, was the real driver of this participation. So he told me about this possibility, and I was more than happy and honored to present today. So I will keep my presentation brief. So just to stressing some important ideas in my opinion, and then I will leave some space for discussion after the 4 presentations. So the topic of today, as Cornelius anticipated, is about the role of imagination for innovation. And in particular, when we think about innovation, you may have in mind, anything like, a new product or a new service or a new business model or a scientific discovery. So any kind that is novel, right? And especially, in the case of radical innovations, we can classify 2 main determinants of innovation. One is imagination. So imagination is, let me say, the ability to think about, new products, new goods, but also, how the society can evolve over time. And so challenge to some extent, the assumptions about reality that we have at the moment. So it's the development of some new ideas. The second determinant is rationality, so our analytical thinking. And analytical thinking is important, especially to validate a certain idea or especially to define the boundaries surrounding a new idea. So in general, there is this complementarity between rationality and imagination in the production of new ideas and in the generation of innovation. A clear example of this complementarity between rationality and imagination is provided by science, especially if you have in mind, the relativity theory of Einstein. This is a clear example on how rationality and imagination work together to challenge a current paradigm and propose a new idea. So the basic idea of Einstein was to challenge the idea by Newton in his Principia Mathematica that was the time is an absolute concept, right? Instead, the idea of Einstein was when we have a large mass, this large mass is able to shape the space surrounding this mass, and so this has a great implication also for the time. So according to the distance at which you are located from this mass, basically the time passes at a different speed. And in particular, this idea of the theory of relativity was that time moves from being an absolute concept to be a relative concept, right? And in particular, the evolution then was that space and time cannot be anymore ontologically separated. In fact, today, in physics, but also in many other disciplines, we talk about space-time, okay? So why imagination and rationality work together in that case? Because, obviously Einstein was probably influenced by Kant, by Mach, and also by other philosophers and scientists. And so the original idea was an imagination act to try to imagine what happens if we relax some hypotheses, some assumptions about the reality that in that very case was the one developed by Newton. Okay, but then Einstein developed also a system of equation, and after solving this system of equation, we were able to some extent to challenge and to falsify the current Newtonian paradigm and understand which are the contingencies associated to that old paradigm. In the sense that the Newtonian physics is still valid under certain conditions, but under other conditions instead we have the so-called new physics. So the revolution by Einstein. So rationality helps a lot to falsify and to challenge current paradigms. This is the case of science, but there are also many cases in market paradigms, for instance. And instead, imagination is able to replace an old paradigm with a new paradigm. This is the typical complementarity between these two. So, in a few words, what is imagination? You may find a lot of different definitions of imagination. I really like the definition of Comporoso, Satanasio, and Fotaki, that is, imagination is where it all begins. It's very
Samuel, if
subjective.
I might we are not seeing changes in the slides. We see the presenter's view, and the slide did move now, so you might want to check that.
Okay. I don't know. Let me see. I don't know if you see now moving the slides.
Now the slides have moved.
Yeah, that's good.
Presenting view, but it's good.
Okay. Let me see again.
I guess you need to switch. Yeah, right now.
Now it's good.
Perfect.
Now it's good or not?
It was good. Now it's back to the presenter view.
Okay. Let me see.
Very good like this.
Okay. Now you see also moving the slides?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Yes. And so basically, this was the definition of Comporoso, Satanasio, and Fotaki, but there are also other definitions that are to some extent, more precise or more detailed, like the one by Gardner, in which, imagination is the generation of hypotheses about how the world might look, and might act. So the idea is to present some hypotheses and so some uncertainty, right? So when you engage in an imagination process, obviously imagination is intertwined with uncertainty. And so you know that you are imagining something, but then after, future collection of data, future collection of emotions, information, etc., this idea may be changed in the future. In general, behind imagination, there is a huge philosophical debate. So here you may find some big names involved in this. But what matters for this presentation, obviously, I don't have the time to present all of these philosophical positions. But what matters, in my opinion, is the philosophical function of imagination. So in my opinion, imagination should help humans explore the ontology of the reality. But I mean, not only the perceived reality, but the physical reality. So in the case of Einstein, we saw that through imagination, Einstein was able to grasp what was the real physical reality of the gravity, right, and of the space-time. Right. So, and if Einstein would have followed just his perception, that discovery and that innovation would have been impossible. Right. So, the idea of imagination is to help humans to explore the ontology of the reality. And to do this, it's important to focus on the connections of the different entities in a particular phenomenon or in a particular reality. Just to be pragmatic and practical. Suppose that you want to understand how societies are evolving, right? So the imagination should help you to isolate the different elements of the society, like citizens, institutions, any kind of elements that you have, and try to understand which are the possible connections that are not yet there, but there may be in the future, right? So in order to create new connections and so new ideas and innovations. In the philosophy of imagination, another big debate is about operationalism and constructivism. So in general, operationalism relate to all of the single steps necessary to understand the ontology of a certain aspect or of a certain phenomenon. And instead, constructivism, by contrast, is still, is the construction of purely imaging concepts, right? And obviously, there is this big debate, especially in physics and in art sciences. But even, in theoretical physics or in mathematics, many people believe in constructivism. So in the importance of imagination, at least at the beginning of the imagination process in order to discover new knowledge, new ideas, and innovation. So, which are the characteristics of imagination? Obviously, imagination is inherently subjective because it relies on memory, right? So, when now there are also scientific proofs of this. So, when we engage in an imagination process, we use our memory. So, we try to retrieve some data, some information, and some previous experiences. And we use these elements in order to create new meanings of things. In particular, there is this famous person that is Demis Hassabis, that was the co-founder of DeepMind and also of isomorphic labs. And during his PhD in cognitive neurosciences at the University College London, was able to prove scientifically that the process of imagination and memory share a common functioning brain mechanisms, right? And so this initial idea of the fact that imagination is strongly intertwined with memory led some scholars and also some pundits to wonder whether we could, in principle, delegate imagination to artificial intelligence, right? There is also a double advantage of this, that is, memory in an artificial intelligent machine means simply the retrieval of information and data. Instead, in the case of a human brain, as I told you before, this retrieval of information may be distorted. So some experiences that we remember from the past are not the real experiences that we had in the past, but they are distorted by our mind. Obviously, here I'm presenting, the cover of Flatland, the book by Edwin Abbott, in which, there were the inhabitants of this world in only 2 dimensions. And so for these inhabitants of this bidimensional world, was impossible to understand our world made of 3 dimensions. That is how we perceive the world, right? So sometimes, experiences may be a danger to our imagination. But the answer to the question, can imagination be delegated to artificial intelligence, is no, at least at the moment. And the answer no is simple, because artificial intelligence, at least at the moment, has no conscience, okay? So even when we look beneath the surface of the definition of imagination, so for instance, we split between primary imagination and secondary imagination. So basically the subconscious ability to blend and unify perceptions, emotions, and experiences, or the conscious ability to try to see something that is not here at the moment. This is impossible for artificial intelligence without a human input, okay? Because at the moment, artificial intelligence has no conscience. And I don't know in the future, but I'm quite skeptical. So for AI, human input is necessary. And here I have 3 examples to understand why it's impossible to delegate imagination to artificial intelligence. So here you see 3 big scientific discoveries. So the uncertainty principle by Heisenberg, the infinity of infinities by Georg Cantor, and also the recent idea of white holes by Carlo Rovelli. So when you look at this innovation, is not only a process of, combining data, retrieving memory, combining information, using, even in the theoretical case of sensors, applied to artificial intelligence about emotions, but instead, the origin of all of these 3 discoveries is a conscious act. So an act of conscience to understand what can be used to discover a certain thing and what cannot be used to discover a certain thing. And in this case, the case of the uncertainty principle by Heisenberg is very simple to explain in this very domain. So Heisenberg discovered that when you look at subatomic particles, it's impossible to know with precision the position of a particle and the speed of this particle. And in order to have the scientific proof of this discovery, so use a lot of calculations, matrices, etc., but his conscience guided him to use only a part of data available. Because if Heisenberg would have used all of the data available, it was impossible for him to show this principle. Why? Because there was a distortion in the measurement, and the observation itself was the problem behind the uncertainty principle. So Heisenberg was able to understand, okay, I need to use only this type of data in order to prove my idea. Translating, the words of Heisenberg, so even when calculus is the only way to infer, the ontological nature of a thing, or just to produce new ideas and new knowledge, that is the typical case in which we all believe that artificial intelligence is better than us. The idea of Heisenberg is, wait, calculus should not start from a description of facts, but instead should start from the creation of relationships and mental connections. And these mental connections are strongly driven by conscience. This is why artificial intelligence is not suitable by itself without human input for pure imagination. And another case is also the application of calculus, right? So if you look at the mathematics used in old physics or in modern physics, for instance, is completely different. So having understood, the role of human mind in imagination, now the point is to understand how this imagination process works. So there is
about 5 more minutes.
Yes. There is a large consensus about that the production of new ideas is driven by individual cognition, and individual cognition has two main elements, so individual factors and environmental factors. And there is this big debate whether, these two factors can be ontologically separated or not. Regardless of this theoretical debate, the key question is the human mind passively reflecting on the world, so simply receiving stimuli from the environment and then react with new ideas, with imagination, etc., or instead the human mind also actively contributes to change the world? So I think that the answer is both ways are there, but there are many examples of the active role of human mind in imagination. So one example is von Neumann in 1966. He was able to develop all of the logical rules of all types of auto-replication, regardless of the nature of the entity, so biological, mechanical, and digital. And at that time, it was impossible to receive some environmental stimuli driving this imagination. So this is an example of an active role of human mind. And the other element of the active role is that von Neumann also provided a necessary condition for auto-replication, that is the presence of rules for auto-replication to give to the replicated entity. This is the basics of DNA and RNA that was developed almost 30 years after. Another example of the active role is this theory of the universe by Liz Mollin, in which the idea is that universe is a living organism, is a biological organism that reproduces through black holes. So this imagination act completely changed our perspective. That is not physics that matter to understand the universe, but is the biology. Okay, and this is very in line with also what Anaxagoras developed 2,500 years ago. So this is quite interesting. But now moving to the last part of my presentation, so I would move to the role of images, right? So when we talk about imagination, we always talk about images. And are images necessary or good for innovation or not? So according to Frege, for instance, what we think is not what we see. And so according to Frege, not only visual intuition is not necessary for developing new knowledge and new ideas, but is detrimental. So this is a very radical position. Reichenbach is also quite skeptical about this, but instead other scholars are in favor of images. Like Taine, for instance, mentioned that it's impossible to think without images, but also Gauss, Lagrange, Riemann, you see a lot of people believe in the role of images. I think that, to solve this debate, we need to understand the difference between physical images or real images and mental images, okay? This is the key difference. And now, there is empirical evidence that physical images provide an initial input to start building mental images that then develop over time. Okay, this is the current state of the art. The very final part is, okay, now we talk about, you know, the role of imagination, the philosophy behind imagination, the process of imagination, but what is the final link to translate an imaging into an innovation? The mechanical link that is the missing link between an image and innovation is communication. In the sense that we know that to produce an innovation, so to move from an idea to a real innovation, we need resources. And so we need to convince some stakeholders to provide resources in order to produce a certain innovation. And so technically, so if you want to visualize, so the image needs to move from the innovator set to the stakeholder set. And so it's important to communicate our ideas and the way through which we communicate these ideas. And now in the management literature, we are developing this concept that is called cognitive overlap. In the sense that, you know, sometimes it's very difficult to signal the quality of an idea or the viability of an idea. And so we need to engage in a cognitive process with stakeholders. So we need to not only to provide, let me say, numbers associated with innovation or the calculation of a value of innovation, the expected value of an innovation, but we need to try to situate and share an image through interaction with stakeholders. So to some extent, we need to make what is subjective explicit in the eyes of the stakeholders. Thanks a lot.
You have about 1 more minute. Or are you? Was that?
Yeah, I'm done.
You finished. Oh, perfect.
Yes, perfectly on time.
Great. Thank you very much. As I said, we'll have a discussion at the end with all the 4 presentations. So now it's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker. And I'm very, very happy to see Ryan again, who I recently met in Amsterdam in person. And so it's very nice to now be here again in the virtual realm. His talk is on toxic techno-economic positivity, when the SPRU model modeled away the limits to growth with the promise of innovation. Ryan, I'm looking forward to this, and you have the floor.
Looking forward to it, even though you've heard some of it before, Cornelius.
That's why I look forward to it.
Who has heard an earlier version of this this work that I'm doing. So let's just pull up that slide deck there. That should be good. So thank you. And Cornelius heard this at East 4S earlier in the summer. This work is a kind of random fact that I encountered in writing my new book that came out this year, which I will do a non-humble blurb about at the end and make sure that you know where to find the new book. This is kind of unrelated. You know when you're working on a project and you randomly encounter a little fact that, oh, that's worth going down the rabbit hole for. This is one of those random facts. I encountered a book written by Sprue, Christopher Freeman and crew, which I found fascinating and I thought was worth digging into to understand the intellectual history of innovation studies and of how innovation shows up in government. So that's what we're working from today. I'm broadly interested. Some people on the call would know, and some people watching the video might know. Broadly interested in methods, the tools and techniques that we use, both in innovation studies and innovation practice, and how those tools and techniques kind of shape the ways we think about and enact innovation. So part of that is here. I'm interested here in the kinds of methods that were established very early on as innovation studies started to establish some disciplinary boundaries around itself. So to say, this is what the good study of innovation is, this is what it's not, and how certain kinds of ways of thinking about and observing innovation were established back in the 1970s. So in this paper and in this talk, I'm interested in those 2 books that are on the screen right now. They are a call and response set. And let's get right into them. So the limits of growth. It's not an innovation studies book at all. Some people might not be familiar with the Club of Rome and the MIT group who published this breakthrough book in 1972. It was the first mathematical attempt, computational attempt to model the limits of growth on a finite planet in this world. The Models of Doom is the American version of a book published by Sprue, the Science Policy Research Unit of the University of Sussex, one of the leading centers, broadly accepted as one of the leading centers for innovation study in the world. And it was the first book that they published. It's actually the second edition of the first book they published. As you'll see in a moment, they changed the name over time. So The Limits to Growth, as I said, written by Meadows, Randers, and Behrens, is this widely read, especially in government circles and in advocacy circles, widely read attempt to show that we're running out of resources on this planet. We have grown an economy that cannot be supported by the finite carrying capacity of the Earth. And of course, it's got all kinds of problems because written in the 70s, using new computer techniques, using kind of incomplete data, and the authors admit that in the book. Many economists responded very negatively to this work. One of those responses was the response by the soon-to-be innovation scholars, right? Not quite calling themselves innovation scholars yet, still calling themselves science policy scholars. And so they respond, and actually they have a meeting, an in-person meeting, to talk about a preprint version of The Limits to Growth. They bring Meadows to Sussex to talk about it, and then they publish a scathing critique, and get in the good books with all the other economists who hate this idea that the Earth might have limits. Their critique originally doesn't have such a scathing name, so it is reprinted for an American audience. They call it Models of Doom, and getting as quickly as I can to the point, they are calling Meadows doomsayers. So they're saying that anyone who believes that we're headed toward natural limits is just promoting kind of doomsdayism. And lots of economists pick up this kind of language and modeling in saying that we're kind of writing off the limits to growth by calling it doomsdayism. Multiple people use that lingo. There have been multiple studies of the kind of history of this moment, but not with a focus on innovation studies, really with a focus on how this shaped the environmental movement and how it shaped government thinking around environmentalism. And the work by Spru was only kind of a bit of a footnote in that. This is one of many books that criticize the limits to growth and use similar kinds of arguments. I'm interested not in how it shaped the environmental movement, but how it shaped our understanding of innovation and the ways that we went on to think about and study innovation in the aftermath of this debate. So I'm interested in kind of the epistemic culture that Spru is starting to develop within its own organization and within what will eventually become kind of what they feel will be a field, a disciplinary field that they're central to establishing. Right? This is the time when this unit is creating the Journal of Research Policy. Chris Freeman, they've just collected all the data for Chris Freeman's his big breakthrough book, The Economics of Industrial Innovation. And so this is a really important time in the kind of formation of innovation as a field of scholarly inquiry. And yet we don't write and think a lot about this little side debate about the limits to growth. So what were Meadows et al. Saying? They were writing a book using computational modeling, saying we hope that this book will lead thoughtful men and women in all fields of endeavor to consider the need for concerted action now if we're going to preserve the habitability of this planet for ourselves and our children. And how were they doing that? In the most complex way imaginable. This is their model. Okay, this reminds me of some of the systems of innovation maps that I've seen in the kind of like Schumpeter Society kinds of conference meetings, right? But it's a system dynamics model. System dynamics modeling was a new way of mathematical modeling that was being developed at MIT at the time. And all of those lines, this is actually the kind of visual representation of a computer mathematical model with data inputs that they could run, and they ran on a computer system, and that has been run for 30 years and more since. So very complex. Spru went into that complexity, and different scholars at Spru and connected with Spru wrote chapters in an edited collection about the various problems of different elements of this model. And this became their first book that they published. Spru's first book, 1973. They were, as I said, had just collected the Project Sappho results. Sappho becomes this really important project that leads to Chris Freeman's breakthrough book in 1974. But in the meantime, in 1973, they're saying they're developing this extensive and sometimes severe criticism of the limits to growth. And that's Christopher Freeman in his own words, extensive and sometimes severe. They were one of many voices that attacked this as doomsday rhetoric. So they said, In general, we do not believe that the physical constraints are quite so pressing as the MIT team suggests. We do not accept their enthusiastic endorsement of zero growth as the ideal for the world. And how do they get to that conclusion? Well, they get there by doing some fancy math. Other people have examined how that sprue research showed up in that broader limits debate, but I'm trying to understand how it shaped, as I said, the kind of innovation research and policy and so on. So I'm using a method that I talk a little bit about in my new book. I do it autoethnographically in my new book. Here I'm doing something called critical ethnostatistics. So I'm interested in the work of professional scholars and how they construct statistics and numerals and how they use it in their scholarly research. This is not a kind of method that many people use. Gephardt developed this in the 1980s. I was 7 years old when he published his first book on it. And it's hardly been used since. So he's an organizational scholar. It's got some limited use in organizational studies, the field where I come from, and especially in critical management studies. It has been used once that I can find to directly study innovation statistics. But I've argued that it might give us some new ways of looking at the quantitative methods and measurements that are used in innovation research and how that is sometimes problematic. And lots of people have written about it being problematic. Of course, Godin has done some great, or had done some great work on where innovation numbers come from and how we measure innovation. Galt, sorry, there's a T missing there, Galt 2018, has both a book and a journal article about this. What ethnostatistics gives us is a way to look in the culture of those numbers, the culture that's being established around those numbers. So I'm doing kind of ethnography with the numbers and with the way that the scholars write about their numbers work. This is also a way in this particular paper of disentangling the culture that allowed growth and innovation to become entangled together in these scholarly conversations and in these governmental conversations, because in case you don't know, Sprue is hugely influential at the OECD in establishing norms of measuring innovation, especially in the 1970s. So in examining those two books and a whole bevy of books that are surrounding them, and some, Sprue actually publishes a series of follow-up books about different ways of modeling. I've noticed, I think, kind of three markers, three kinds of mimetic patterns that I think play out in the future of innovation studies and policy. The first is that from the very beginning of their response to limits to growth, Sprue is fetishizing data precision. So throughout the text and throughout the texts that accompany this, there's this recurrent theme where they're saying the data is just not good enough. You can't make these claims without perfect data or without at least better data. Same time in the background, we now know that Sprue is doing a lot of work to establish what the norms for data might be and to build their own massive data set for the project SAPO. So the fetishization of data precision becomes a key part of what that unit is doing and what kind of carries through to the future of innovation studies. Of course, in order to make the claims that are being made in the book, they are positioning social and economic change as anthropocentric. So this kind of operating assumption that we humans can overcome the limits to growth on the planet because we're ingenious and kind of the planetary resources serve us. And so we can kind of innovate our way out of this problem. And then the last one, which I think is most important and is kind of the subject that I wanted to really emphasize today, is that they're establishing this kind of techno optimism that is toxic, this notion of a kind of not just a pro-innovation bias, but a kind of infectious and environmentally dangerous assumption that innovation is good. So I've got empirical material on these, and I don't know that I've got enough time to dig into each of them, but there's some examples in the top row. You'll see examples of direct quotes from the limits to growth, from the environmentalists, and then on the bottom you'll see quotes from the innovation scholars, sorry, the other way around. So on the top, we've got the innovation scholars fetishizing data precision. Since there's no firm empirical evidence, any relationships in this model, all of the lines in that chart must be arbitrary because we don't have perfect empirical evidence. The database is inadequate, and so we really can't do this kind of work until we've got better statistics. We shouldn't be really talking about the limits to growth until we've got better numbers. And Meadows and team, actually, in the second edition of the Sprue book, they're invited to write a response, and this is really telling. they write this response to this scathing critique, and they criticize the innovation scholars who are criticizing them. They say, you know, instead of waiting for perfect models, we need to construct and implement the best models we have today to understand what's happening, recognizing that there are limits to this. The emphasis is meant to be on the equation, not on the equations, but the intricacy of the models, but on what it tells us about the world. So don't get hung up on the numbers, get hung up on the relationships that the model seems to show. I will skim over the idea that innovation is anthropocentric. If people want to talk more about that later on, that's absolutely really the way that this is being positioned. Even though later on Freeman really starts to get interested in the natural environment and writes a couple of books and writes some work on this. This really is so much about the future of humans and human ingenuity being able to overcome those limits to growth. The one that I wanted to really emphasize today is this idea that gets established in that 1972 and 1973 work by Spru, that technological change is the thing that makes this debate happen, right? These assumptions about technological change. So the MIT team that's writing about the limits to growth is not assuming that technology will happen. Right? They have not built in any kind of future faith in technology into their models. They've built in the technologies available at the time that they understand them. The Freeman and Spru group have built in numbers that assume that innovation will continue to happen. We don't quite know what innovations will happen, but innovation will overcome these limits. So if we assume, for example, 2% increases in the allocation of certain natural resources, certain critical minerals, we know technology will just continue to help us find new deposits of critical minerals and find a way to pull those from the ground. So it's not that the Spru team is really not trying to predict or observe certain technologies or social innovations that are going to overcome the limits. What they're doing instead is they're establishing kind of the mathematical models for a belief that eventually some kind of human innovation will overcome these limits. So how this shows up today is this is kind of at this formative moment. Data precision becomes fetishized, as I suggested. Spru is at the same time positioning itself as data connoisseurs and cementing their position as really key influencers of government policy. We're very much seeing some positioning of nature in service of humanity and humanity in mastery over nature through technology and innovation. And I'm seeing anyway, this establishment of not just a pro-innovation bias, but a specific way that the culture around innovation research is being poisoned by technological optimism. So this assumption that we need to assume that someone will eventually innovate. And our work as innovation scholars isn't to try and help enact innovation or even observe and predict what innovations might happen, but to sit back and believe that innovation will kind of unfold in a way that's positive for humanity. So this response that Spru wrote to the limits to growth really, I believe, significantly advanced its reputation, even though a lot of people haven't read the book. A lot of economists at the time in the 1970s read the book. A lot of policymakers at the time in the 70s read the book and started to look for the next work that would come out of Spru. The ideological and methodological toolkit that they were developing really shaped their team, shaped the kind of work that they were doing, led to multiple books, and I can see some influence in key works like Christopher Freeman's Economics of Industrial Innovation. So although most people think that book in 1974 was the first major contribution by Spru, this slightly earlier book, I think, had a lasting and much less conspicuous impact on the epistemic nature of research and government policy in innovation. So that's all for me today. As I said, this was one of those rabbit hole finds when I was working on my book that came out in April. That book, Observing Dark Innovation, is available at Bristol University Press. Thanks so much to Lee Vinsel for the little blurb on the back of it. It's also open access now. We're really excited that a nonprofit in Germany, Knowledge Unlatched Project, paid Bristol to unlatch it and make it open access so you can download PDFs. There's a discount code there for this conference, but also you can just download it and not bother engaging in the economy of academic publishing books. Thanks, everyone.
Oh, thank you very much for the second talk. And I see that audience in Curitiba on the campus has joined us. Hello to you. I'm very happy to see you early in the morning. We'll move directly. Hello. We'll move directly to the third presentation of this morning, and again we'll have the discussion right at the end. Then, so now it's my pleasure to welcome Lee Winsel, and his talk will be on knowing and intervening in innovation policy. So we stick with the topic, the case of the Clinton White House human capital and the new economy. Lee, you have the floor.
Thank you for having me. And can you all see my slides okay?
We can see your slides perfectly fine.
Beautiful. I mean, this is one of those panels where when I saw the image of the papers together, I was like not sure if we were going to connect and, you know, if it was all going to jive. And it turns out I think there's lots of interesting connections and differences already. So thank you for having me. And I'm really glad to be here. I love the NOvation team. So I want to talk through a paper, you know, some parts of a paper I just finished writing this summer. It's been submitted to the History of Science journal, Science in Context, as part of a special issue on interventionist knowledges. So it's about social science knowledge that gets used to like intervene in society or the economy. It's mostly made up of histories of economics, but there's also histories of anthropology and psychology and stuff, and instances where these things get used to try to shape society. And I'm going to kind of try to spin out a kind of an innovation studies version of the paper. I mean, the innovation is very much at the core of the story, but in the way I wrote it up for historians of science, it's a little bit different than I would do it. And this is part of a bigger book project that I'm working on called A Good History of Shit Jobs. This will be a trade press history book. I'm working on it with my literary agent right now. And that book takes as its launching place this finding. United Way is this big nonprofit in the United States, and one of the things it does is look at poverty and financial hardship. And they have this program called ALICE. I won't go into what ALICE, the acronym, stands for, but basically this group measures poverty at the county level in different states around the country, and it finds that routinely finds that about 40% of American households can barely afford to make ends meet. And so the point of this book is to say, like, well, why is that the case? And the title is the kind of hypothesis I'm working, which is that the American economy since the 70s has filled up with low-paying, poorly benefited shit jobs, what I call shit jobs in that sense. So, you know, just to kind of talk about where this project coming from, I think in earlier work, including beating up on campus innovation myths and like innovation campuses and these things, I was really focused on these kind of innovation policies that have spread around that don't deliver in any measurable way, and like bad innovation policy. You know, you can find that in things I've written for the Chronicle of Education. You can find that in spades in this book I wrote with Andy Russell, the Innovation Delusion. And I think in part of what I'm up to in this project is I'm really interested in kind of innovation knowledges, like what people think they know about the economy and what we need to do as a result of it. And I'm also interested in what some literature is called non-knowledge, which is knowledge we think we know that turns out not to be knowledge, something like that. I'm just going to leave that alone. And then also forms of knowledge that don't get acted on, there's lots of things we know, but they don't turn into any form of meaningful action. So I'm interested in both of those things. And just to kind of bring in part of my approach here, I'm going to be talking about Robert Reich, who is this kind of popular writer still to this day, but was from the 1980s to the present. But he was the Secretary of Labor in the Clinton White House. And what I'm interested in is how, you know, we can think of narrative economics, the role of stories in the way, you know, economic thinking works. We can think of motivated reasoning, how we kind of like go out, we believe something, we go out and cherry pick data to like fit our worldview, or cultural cognition, the same thing as motivated reasoning, but applied to how groups come to believe certain things and act on it by kind of convincing each other of certain worldviews. This is kind of like the perspective I'm taking on Reich and the people in the Clinton White House. And some of you may know I'm very influenced by my friend Brent Goldfarb's and David Kirsch's book, Bubbles and Crashes on Technology Bubbles. So I'm telling this as a story of like technology, how technology bubbles end up kind of influencing thinking. Okay. And finally, one other kind of approach. This is, some of you may have heard me talk about this before. In this project, I'm trying to work all the time at two levels. The first level is thinking about ideas about the economy, discourses about the economy, ideologies about the economy, BSs about the economy, all these kinds of things. And then actually getting at the actual material change and trying to figure out what was happening in the economy to the best of our ability to figure that out. And part of my critique here is I think various fields have gotten too stuck at the discursive level for lots of reasons. A lot of times it has to do with the influence of Foucault, but sometimes it's just way easier to reconstruct discourses than to get an economic change sometime and do the actual materialist research that it takes to like think through these things. So this is kind of where I'm playing with, and you'll see this come out as I talk through things. Okay, so I'm really been, for a couple of years now, I've been really interested in this thing called the new economy, which was this notion that developed in the 1990s that things were really changing in a deep way. And this is all kind of caught up with innovation discourses and technological change discourses. A lot of it's focused on computing. And then it falls off a cliff face in 2002 when the dot-com bust happens, basically. So it turns out to have been very tied up in a technology bubble. One of the reasons I'm interested in the new economy is because in some ways, my story, my shit job story from the 70s to the present is a story of economic stagnation by lots of measures, including productivity measures. The economy's been pretty stagnant. So the new economy moment, if you read Robert Gordon's book, The Rise and Fall of American Growth, it really is a state of exception in this 50-year period. Okay, so I'm interested in like how thinking kind of shifted in this moment where it looked like the economy was quickly changing. And oh, here's Gordon's a chart from Gordon's book. This is measures of total factor productivity. You know, classically, there's this famous moment from 1920 to 1970 where there's a lot of technological change and productivity shifts happening. Then the 70s hit, everything turns to crap. Like it's the 70s. And then like you have this moment in the 90s where things kind of go back up again. Like this is the material change, right? Okay, so I've been looking at the Clinton White House as like trying to think through how policy thinking was changing. I often start talks about this with Clinton coming out in 2001, right, and giving this. He has this thing, conference on the new economy at the White House with all these economists, and he says the new economy is like going to change the economy as deep as the Industrial Revolution did and blah, blah, blah. And it's all about this lasting. There's going to be this deep. And the joke is that a month previously, the dot-com bust had started. So whenever we hold conferences, it's always when things are already over, right? And we don't realize it. So I'm looking at Robert Reich, and he's the Secretary of Labor during the Clinton administration. I'm going to skip that. He earlier in the 1980s, he's like centrally involved in he was one of the central thinkers of industrial policy, which is a democratic, anti-Reagan way of trying to put forward a vision of how the government can play a positive role in economic growth. And of course, this is back in spades. Right now, it's like we have left and right versions of the industrial policy. It's all over the planet, including in the UK, but it's very big right now in the States. So it's come back. And my argument is that I think part of what I'm up to in the paper is saying, we're so focused on neoliberalism, but I think that we need to trace kind of non-neoliberal policy trajectories that were continuing through the 80s and 90s. And I think Reich is a good example of this. So I really like this book, The Origins of Non-Liberal Capitalism, about Germany and Japan, that comes out from Wolfgang Streeck in the late 90s. And I think this is like, Reich and all the other Democrats, including Clinton, are really looking, especially to Japan, but also to Germany and other states, to say, like, this is Italy, this is a model of how governments can play a role in the economy and kind of foster growth and all these kinds of things. So I think, part of what what shift is happening in Reich's thinking between the 80s when he's doing this industrial policy stuff, and the 90s when his thinking changes, and is two things kind of. The first is endogenous growth theory, which is Romer and these theories of how human capital contributes to economic growth via innovation, basically. That you're training up your people, they're creating new ideas, and that's creating growth. Reich kind of buys into this. He doesn't really talk about it very explicitly, but he definitely believes this. And the other thing is, I think the timing's a little off here from what I originally wrote, and now it's not a part of the paper, but there's also something like skill bias technical change. And that's the idea that like wage growth is better for people who have high skills, and that explains the gap between like low wage and high wage people. And so that the answer to that then is that you have to give people training to get them into the high wage places. And so Reich, by the early 1990s, he writes this book, The Work of Nations, Preparing Ourselves for 21st Century Capitalism. And in that book, he introduces this new character, the symbolic analyst. It's basically his version of the knowledge economy, which is also taking off in countries like the UK and Sweden. It's this third way, kind of thing. It's all about creativity and innovation, and, all that stuff's on the way, right? But, this is Reich's version. And, these are people who manipulate symbols, and he thinks this is the high skill work that we need to get people into, basically. And he has this whole section on the rise of the symbolic analyst and why it explains economic inequality. But what's like not many folks know is that these ideas get built directly into Clinton and Gore's campaign book that they published in 1992. So these ideas get built directly into the kind of the promises of the Clinton campaign. And it's all about like human capital theory, basically, and how there's like promises of federal training and all these kinds of things. Okay, and then this new economy idea emerges in 94 to 95. It's all about innovation. It's a moment, it's part of this upward trajectory of innovation rhetoric for sure. And eventually, it doesn't start out this way. Well, one of the things I track in the paper is when they start talking about the new economy, it's originally not capitalized. It's just the new economy. And it's not so much about Silicon Valley. But by the late 90s, it's very much about Silicon Valley and digital technologies, and it's become capitalized. So some shift happens over a couple years about how people are thinking about this. So what I do in this paper is I trace the thinking around this thing called the Reemployment Act of 1994. And it's a failed bill. It's the most Reichian bill, right? In some ways, it's like the non-liberal policy that the Clinton White House put all kinds of energy behind in 1994, but it fails. And there's a variety of reasons why these non-liberal policies kind of didn't win out, and the more neoliberal budget-conscious policies do win out. It has to do with who's in the White House and all this kind of stuff. But there is this non-liberal version of what's going on in the White House. So this law is basically a revision of federal worker training laws to get laid off workers into new industries. That's what it's supposed to do, okay? And Reich's ideas about the Reemployment Act, I get into all the White House papers and reconstruct how this works. It's really held together. It's three parts that are kind of working together. Two parts are bodies of social scientific data, what we call knowledge. I'm just not going to deal with that philosophical issue for a second. And then there's a myth, okay? The first bit of social scientific knowledge is studies of displaced workers that were coming out of like the Congressional Budget Office and other kinds of places. Now, and Ryan, this gets at the deindustrialization. It's all caught up in this deindustrialization thing, right? And I should say, first of all, that Reich's interpretations of these reports are controversial, and including the Congressional Budget Office thinks that these layoffs are basically normal, and that's not Reich's argument. But he's drawing on this literature of like laid off workers. The second thing is he actually has the Department of Labor put together studies of how federal reemployment training works, and like what reemployment training it works the best, what forms of it work the best, right? They're doing studies of training programs, basically. Then the third piece is this kind of myth of the new economy. Reich is saying, well, he has this story about, we have these laid off workers. The reason they're laid off is the US economy is deeply changing and becoming a knowledge economy. And what we have to do is retrain them through these training programs, right? But the connective tissue that this story of the new economy actually doesn't have much support. And he gets very vague when he talks about it. He has all these numbers, and then there's the connective tissue, no numbers, right? There's no findings of the kind of supporting the myth. It's just his story about what's going on. So he starts giving, these talks in 95, a little bit later, about the revolt of the anxious class. He has this picture where there's like the upper class, they're super rich, they're getting richer. There's the lower class, the underclass of people who are just screwed. And then there's the anxious middle class. And what is undercutting the anxious middle class? Technology, globalization. It's basically those two things. And then corporate greed, maybe like layoffs and stuff like that. But that's what he has, this picture that technology and globalization are undermining this middle class and making them fall into the underclass. So what's the answer? It's all about skills. He's constantly talking about skills as the answer to this technological change and innovation. And he's also saying, if following Romer, he's saying, if we get our people more skills, they'll produce more innovation, more economic growth, that whole story, right? So, he really kind of buys, these technological vision and kind of innovation vision of the new economy. He really buys into it, and he starts talking about it. And like, there's this wonderful old interview from him from 95. The website has not changed since 1995. It still looks like this, but it's discoverable and wonderful. And he's saying like, in fact, the most rapidly growing job categories are knowledge intensive. I called them symbolic analysts. Why are they growing so quickly? Blah, blah, blah. The only people who are thriving in the new economy are people who are becoming more valuable, because, this is the story that he's telling all the people and going out and giving interviews. Okay, so now this is the materialist critique, right? Part of the reason I'm interested in the two-level thing is I really think that materialist critique, going back to Marx, but also including all forms of non-Marxist materialism, really do depend on the rub between ideology and actuality. Going back to the German ideology, I think this really matters. And part of what's going on here is that Reich was telling stories that don't hold up according to the data, including data that was coming out of the Department of Labor. He's not reading reports out of his own agency, it turns out. Okay, it's really wild. So, just to give one example, when Reich was telling stories about, technological change, he was always pointing to these firms that he thinks are like highly innovative. But Nelson Lichtenstein, in his new book on the Clinton administration, shows that like most of those firms that he thought were highly innovative were out of business within a couple years. Okay, so like he doesn't know what actually, because it's very hard to know that actually. But the more important thing is that he keeps talking about how the fastest, you saw him, I read it, the fastest growing job categories are these high skill symbolic analyst jobs. That is just not true. The fastest growing jobs in the United States were two kinds of home health aides, which are the shittiest, lowest paid, most stressful, most like health problem inducing jobs there are. And in general, like if we do studies of the Department of Labor's own studies during this period, their projections of the fastest growing jobs they're mostly low paid jobs. And this turned out to be true. And it was true from the 80s to basically until, I have data from like the early 2000s, and I'm going to track it forward. So he's kind of telling stories that turn out to not really be true. And I'm going to wrap up here in a minute. So I'm heading towards. So I think part of why this story matters is that even it's a failed bill, but the logic behind it really lives on, especially in the Democratic Party. So, eventually Dan Green has done great work on like how the Clinton administration starts telling stories about the digital divide between the internet's haves and haves not. That is also about skills and like the need to get people into, kind of internet skill world. They're putting out reports in 2000 saying the way to deal with like racial and gender inequality is to get women and poor Black people technical skills. And, by the early 2000s, people like Barack Obama is repeating this same like verbiage, giving talks like the 21st century schools for 21st century economy. This idea that skills is the answer to economic inequality becomes really central to especially the Dem vision of the world. So again, what I'm interested in this new work is like, what is knowledge and innovation policy? I mean, it's an interesting kind of maybe tension with Ryan's point about data and stuff like that. It's like, what is our knowledge that we think we have about the world? And when is it reliable? And then the other thing is just, my continued thinking about the role of technology bubbles in driving ideas about what needs to be done for the economy. We see this in spades around AI right now. I mean, my God, so much chatter about how AI is going to change everything and what we need to do for young people and all this stuff as a result of it. And I think among other things, this kind of technology bubble driven ideas of innovation policy keep us from looking at deeper ills, including just the fact that like a huge percentage of people in my nation are stuck in these really super low paid, shitty jobs and have a bunch of negative health impacts and other things as a result of that. Okay. And that's it. Thank you so much. 20 minutes and 30 seconds. So I'm sorry for going.
It's all good. Thank you very much. And we go to the last presentation in this early morning panel by Les Levidov. I saw him before. I hope he'll rejoin us in any second. Les, are you still? Yes, you're there. You're all good. We now see your Word document.
The PowerPoint file. Is that?
Looks very much like a Word document.
Oh, no, it's the wrong one. Because I couldn't find. Here we are. That's what I wanted. Okay, does that work?
Yes, we now see the PowerPoint presentation in the normal edit mode.
All right, here we go. Make it large. Oh.
That looks very good.
Okay.
So it's very nice to have you, Les, with the last talk in the session on inclusive grassroots innovation in the social and solidarity community. Les, you have the floor.
Okay, thanks for the opportunity. The title is Inclusive Grassroots Innovation, Alternative Agri-Food Networks in the Social Solidarity Economy, with other co-authors. I'm trying to move it on. Oh, here we are. Okay, we'll start with the dominant hegemonic ideology about which was the target of criticism by the previous two speakers, rightly so. I'll give it only a minute. So mainstream top-down technological innovations are generally expensive, capital-intensive innovations, which exclude the interests and aspirations of lower-income people, and not for lack of skills, as the previous two speakers have decided. Over the last 2 decades, they generate social inequality, environmental degradation, and unsustainable futures, argue many critics. Over the last 2 decades, the concept inclusive innovation has been counterposed for affordable, widely relevant, and socially beneficial alternatives. This paper explores the role of the social solidarity economy, especially as it overlaps with alternative agri-food networks, in order to demonstrate the meanings of inclusive grassroots innovation. So inclusive innovation has been one of many umbrella concepts as alternatives to the dominant form. This agenda has promoted bottom-up alternatives which serve different needs and aspirations. Grassroots innovation networks generate innovations by and for user groups. The processes entail equitable participation and collective agency. It creates public goods and overcomes socioeconomic inequalities. One source has been the social solidarity economy. It has promoted socioeconomic equity and democratic self-management, also often seeking to overcome gender inequalities. The SSE features short supply chains, which bring producers socially closer to consumers while avoiding profit-driven intermediaries. Producers thereby gain higher incomes, and often consumers gain lower prices for quality products. And that means less economic growth, but with the same or greater social benefit. In recent years, SSE networks have been conceptualized as SSE ecosystems. which encompass cooperatives or social enterprises, their wider networks, and supportive institutions, including public agencies. SSD ecosystems generate agile adaptations to the new disruptive context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Such capacity is often called resilience, which often implies bouncing back to the status quo ante. Yet its practices have often bounced forwards by extending solidaristic bonds, thus creating more just futures. And that conceptual framework is elaborated here for the broad area known as alternative agri-food networks, AAFNs. This category describes alternative ways to link food production, distribution, and consumption. Together, they seek to avoid the conventional industrialized global agri-food system. AFNs are embedded in particular places. They tend to be economically viable for farmers and consumers, use agroecological production methods and short supply chains. And those production methods means fewer commodity inputs, also reducing economic growth, but for better societal benefits. So here we'll look at the intersection of AFNs with SSE ecosystems through that tripartite analytical framework: inclusive grassroots innovation, agile adaptation, and transformative resilience. And here I mentioned in passing that some of these ideas come from my colleagues at SPRU, who took a very different pathway than the ones that was criticized by the previous speaker. So first look at Brazil and then Turkey. So in Brazil, in the late 20th century, there were stronger social movements for agroecology, as represented by the network on the left, and likewise for solidarity economy, logo on the right. And they eventually converged in important ways. We call it Ecosol agroecology for short. It's been promoted by other national and local networks, which together comprise the SSE ecosystem. This includes several advice support networks, include the Red Ecovida, that means network, program Ecoforte, and agri-extensionist agencies of the federal and state governments. A key actor, especially for women's equality, is Sempre Viva Organização Feminista, which links various feminist networks supporting women's initiatives in this area. They promote mutual aid practices known as mutirão. That's an indigenous Guarani term for joint work, which has become popularized by the Ecosol movement. This extends such arrangements from traditional family or neighbor relationships to wider networks, including urban ones. And again, short supply chains in Portuguese, circuitos curtos, the concept probably comes from circuit court in France. Collective marketing initiatives such as farmers markets, box games, and municipal procurement. Here, this illustrates the visual promotion of those connections, valorizados circuitos cortos, with these small promesa from the earth directly to your table. And on the right, comida de verdade, real food, meaning food produced by these agroecological means. In the 1990s, these networks jointly demanded various support measures, especially for capacity building and market access. Such programs were finally created from 2003 onwards by the new government in that period. And these programs included PAIA, whereby agroecological producers learned how to organize themselves for collective marketing. For example, 2 municipalities and farmers markets. Organização de Controle Social, an innovation for gaining organic certification based on farmers' knowledge exchange. So this is a low-cost alternative to expensive third-party certification, which is the method used by capitalist organic farms. Also, the PNI for school meals, whereby public institutions pay a 30% premium price for organic and agroecological products, just making these methods economically more viable for small-scale producers, and likewise for improving the food quality of school meals. Now, COVID-19, in that period, these networks face new obstacles of many kinds, especially from the hygiene requirements and from supply chain disruptions. But From the start, in March 2020, fast response came from a Porto Alegre textile cooperative, Univans, as you know from the phrase Venceremos, United We Will Win. Quickly, it produced 600 face masks for free distribution to health centers, to farmers markets, and other public places. The fabric was donated by the Justa Trama, that is a fair trade loom network, which had routinely supplied organic cotton to Univans. This was widely publicized and inspired many other initiatives to imagine and create new kinds of solidaristic connections in order to overcome obstacles of the pandemic. The new hygiene standards required several measures: disinfecting the food stalls, maintaining a minimum distance between them, wearing gloves, avoiding infection through product handling, packaging, and plastic bags, electronic payment methods, so on. And all these were new challenges for these solidaristic initiatives. Farmers markets were mainly sited outdoors. Few had running water. So they made special efforts to adopt hygiene measures, and some markets had extra assistance from municipal authorities. This photo shows you one of them. And here are a couple of innovations that, when it became more difficult to continue each producer's stall in the farmer's market, they banded together, pooled their products, and so offered greater variety and created a collective drive-in stall, as shown on the left, a drive-through stall, and on the right, quickly they used Facebook to advertise their virtual fair, their virtual, whereby each producer could advertise their products through a WhatsApp connection and to arrange pickup or delivery, depending on feasible logistics. And this is just one town of hundreds or thousands throughout Brazil. So these solidarity initiatives strengthen knowledge exchange about many everyday needs, including herbal remedies, natural medications, and a political campaign to defend common goods against expropriation. Likewise, they spread agroecological practices for both self-consumption, donations, and barter of surplus products. Slow Food Brazil created an interactive map of small-scale producers in order to facilitate such activities through cooperation among all those producers. And new communications logistics systems adapted social media for solidaristic aims. Facebook pages announced new arrangements and reached more consumers than before, especially through WhatsApp orders, as you saw in the previous images. Now we move on to Turkey. Since around the year 2000, Turkey has had a rise of activities comprising the social solidarity economy. There it's called Sosyal Dayanışma Ekonomileri, an informal network of old and new generation cooperatives as a bottom-up process for establishing a social solidarity economy in the agri-food sector. This has many forms, including agri-food alternative production methods, producer connections, consumer cooperatives, collective kitchens, means to support the thousands of refugees who were arriving since the Syrian civil war about a decade ago. Some old rural agricultural cooperatives underwent a reorganization with the aim to strengthen solidaristic principles. And here are two examples mentioned. More recently, urban consumer food co-ops have been an extra means to enable more sustainable forms of urban-rural relationships. This resulted in 80 short agri-food supply chains across many cities. Here's just one example established in and by staff and students at the major university in Istanbul. All these initiatives share their determination to have independence, that is, from the hegemonic agri-food system, in accessing healthy and affordable food in creative, fair, and experimental ways. By analogy to SOF, as you saw in Brazil, here there's Kadın Değerlendirme Vakfı, an association valuing women's labor by helping to find collective marketing opportunities for their cooperatives. All these initiatives use similar criteria to select producers, that is, sustainable production processes, effectively agroecological, no chemical inputs, using local and traditional varieties of seeds, non-exploitative labor, meaning fair wages, or self-employed, and small-scale producers. These criteria do not require organic certification, which would be too costly for small-scale farmers, even if their production methods conform to the organic requirements. Instead, they rely on what's called participatory guarantee systems, a collective kind of self-certification that can be trusted by consumers who want to favor these production methods. So in these ways, solidarity with farmers could be maintained and expanded. Now, COVID-19 in Turkey, as elsewhere, harmed most economic sectors. Food cooperatives face new challenges. These include delays in establishing novel forms of short supply chains, as well as in continuing the earlier SSE initiative. So, as examples of the adaptations, the Book Co-op devised a prepayment system to ensure the continuation of the product supplies. The Natural Food Network and Katekoy Co-op prepared solidarity food packages for needy people to enable their continuous access to food. And this demonstrates that the donations are organized and promoted as solidarity, not as charity. I mean, likewise in Brazil and everywhere else I know during the pandemic. Despite the difficulties, many food cooperatives managed to survive thanks to several capabilities. Their earlier collaboration in the preparative phase of each co-op, their rapid adaptation, continuing open participation through routine meetings online, and their effective use of social media to reach their previous consumers and new ones. Here's a photo of one cooperative, or its women's branch in particular. Ade means women. The food cooperatives develop means to overcome the challenges posed by the pandemic based on earlier experiences and trust relationships. So, yeah, I think this is somewhat repeated. Yeah. So, conclusion has two slides. One, as an alternative and resistance to the hegemonic capital-intensive innovation, inclusive grassroots innovation is generated by and for user groups. Its networks develop equitable participation and collective agency. They seek to create public goods and overcome socioeconomic inequities. As a source of such innovation, the social solidarity economy has been guided by social values of socioeconomic equity and democratic self-management, often featuring women's leadership. Diverse organizations together support and comprise what we call SSE ecosystems. They have devised inclusive grassroots innovation in fulfilling urgent needs of their members, especially during the pandemic. Their adaptive practices are illustrated here by AAFNs. They had already developed short food supply chains for agroecological products, bringing producers socially closer to consumers. In responding to the COVID-19 crisis, they expanded their online platforms by adapting digital communications for delivering or expanding food services. They increased the supply from producers to fulfill the greater demand. In these ways, they extended grassroots innovation through agile adaptations and a transformative resilience, bouncing forwards to a more solidaristic future. So in these ways, AAFNs illustrate our tripartite analytical framework. I'll conclude there.
Well, thank you very much, Les, for the last talk. And now, because you've all been so very good with time, we even have a little more time for discussion, which is now open. I thank all the presenters. You can make yourself known to me by using the raise your hand button in Zoom. And I was quite amazed at how, we had a good look at the imaginaries and the ideologies, behind innovation, and then also the practical adaptations of innovations in the last paper. I'm wondering, does anybody have a very specific question already? And Samuele does, and then it's June, and I'll keep a list, but Samuele first.
If June wants to go first, because I already talked before, so I leave the floor to June, and then I make my question later.
No, we have enough time. We'll.
Okay. No, my question is very simple. So this is just a perception and the feeling that I have, but it seems to me that there is kind of a negative flavor on technological innovation. So in this panel, I saw a lot of especially Ryan, but also partially also Lee, stress these costs associated to innovation, right? So the capital intensive nature of some technological innovation, and also the social cost of innovation, driving, for instance, inequality and all of these, backlashes and collateral effects at the societal level. But I think that there is also another side of the coin that is, for instance, if you look, I have in mind the case of India, for instance. So in India, there is a very positive correlation between innovation and the reduction of poverty. So as soon as you invest in innovation, obviously together, with education and other investments, but this is largely drives the reduction of absolute poverty. Obviously, there is still quite some level of relative poverty, but absolute poverty is largely decreasing. I have also in mind another case that is related to pollution. So there are strong investments in what is called the carbon capture, right? So obviously, if you invest in this, you can foster some, cyclical models, not only of innovation, but also of production, right? So you capture your emissions and you use this CO2 in order to generate, new energy for your production process, right? So I think that, I see the point that obviously we need to work also on the reduction of consumption. This is, very true. But I think that, the technological lever is still necessary if we want to be sustainable, right? And if we want to save the planet.
I think this question goes directly to Ryan and Lee. And I'm not sure who wants to go first.
Lee,
It
do you
seems
want to
like
go?
Ryan.
I mean, I love this question, and I try to tackle this question in my book, and I think we do ignore all kinds of innovation. We put innovation technology in one big black box category. And so yes, the straw man in that category, the easy one, which you've just gotten at, is the bad technologies, right? We ignore the kind of negative effects, and then there's all kinds of reasons why politically we've come to ignore the negative effects. But we do also tend to ignore some of the really positive innovations, and most of the empirical material in my book is about positive environmental changing innovations. Ocean science technologies is kind of the empirical work that I did in my book, is really important innovations, physical technologies built by government agencies, and government agencies aren't supposed to be able to do this thing, right? That are absolutely needed in order to understand the changing climate, the changing ocean, which is related to the changing climate, which are critical to to saving life on this planet. And we really don't enable government to be able to do that. We really don't believe that the public sector should be allowed to build new gizmos. Right? That's supposed to be a thing that private sector does in the market. So yeah, I think there's nuance to this argument, and this is absolutely not the first time. That nuance sometimes is hard to deliver in a short 20-minute talk. I was once accused of, I had someone come over to me and say, "But you're a communist Marxist and you don't believe in the economy, you don't believe in technology innovation." It's like, actually, that's not the position right here, right? As Lee said, you can be a materialist or a new materialist without going there, right? And the same thing here, right? You can be a critical scholar of innovation without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, recognizing that some innovations and technologies are really good for the world and others are really bad. And there's a ton of gray area also.
Yeah, Lee?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Ryan just said. I mean, I think that, we can talk about how the spread of capitalism to places like China and India and these places has lifted, more people out of poverty in the last 30 years than maybe at any point in history, and how that's happened. I think that's an important point. I bring it up all the time because many of my colleagues in academia don't highlight this. They only highlight the kind of negative aspects. And so, being a contrarian, I usually I talk about this often, but I also think like I'm more focused on innovation policy and like direct interventions that are supposed to produce innovation, and there's no evidence that they do, right? So I've written a lot about this in the innovation delusion. And and I here we can bring up Spru again. I draw on Paul Nightingale of Spru and Alex Code, a graduate of Spru, who now works in Latin America, who show, like this science park economy bullshit, that like there's no evidence that these things have created more innovation or economic growth. So I mean, that's really my focus. And when it comes to climate change, I want to talk about this a bit more later, but I started in grad school as a member of a climate change modeling and decision policy group. It's very clear if we're going to deal with climate change, there has to be a lot of technological change. The question is how to get there and how to form policy to get there. But it's not about like, I'm not, we make this very explicit in the innovation delusion. Andy Russell, my co-author, and I, we love like antibiotics, or cesarean sections, or I mean, like there's a lot of things. I can just go on about the things that are great. And we're not opposed to more of that. It's just like a lot of thinking caught up around this stuff. It's just, it's very thin and it doesn't work, create the creative class city changes as an example. I mean, we can go on and on. So, I mean, that's where my critique is more about what we call innovation speak, rather than that's the distinction we make in innovation delusion is the difference between innovation speak and ideology versus like actual change. And very often those two things are not related in any way whatsoever. That's the point, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much. And also, yeah, from the NOvation side, of course, we tend to be more critical, doing critical studies of innovation. So it comes with the territory. But also whenever I, for instance, talk with Thiago, it's always about how innovation is so different, when you go from country to country, from continent to continent, that it really does depend on, what current project you look at and how that figures out. So I think, but that is really something, when we talk about, how we can reimagine innovation, it's probably one thing we always have to carry with us to think, okay, it is so extremely multiple and complex. But the next on the list is June, and then it's Les. June.
Yes, okay. Thanks, great panel. This is to Lee. Lee, I really enjoyed your presentation. It took me back to a previous life because I actually worked in the U.S. Department of Labor pre-Clinton administration. And then when the Clinton administration was doing all the things that you described, I was actually at the state level implementing those programs. And so I enjoyed a rehash sort of where I spent a good many years, but I wanted to add something to your presentation in that the primary impact of the Clinton year changes on the job training, the Department of Labor's approach to job training, is that it was privatized. It was contracted out. And that, in my experience, was the primary driver of the sorts of problems that you talked about. So what happened is that there was new legislation. It was a law change. There was a different piece of legislation, the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act and the Job Training Partnership Act before that. But the legislation that was passed under Clinton basically, brought in this whole series of new institutional entities, one-stop centers, et cetera. But the main thing is it was contracted out to private contractors. And I worked with them. I was in the government. I was in the state of Massachusetts at the time, and we had to contract everything out to private companies, and all kinds of new companies sprung out of the woodwork to, become the training, employment and training providers for the United States of America. They had zero experience in doing any of this. And all of the government programs in the states and the communities and the local areas and the cities got sort of wiped out, and all the institutional knowledge, we were talking about this yesterday, what happens when you wipe out the expertise of government. the hollowing out of government. And that's what happened. They hollowed out the government. They contracted this stuff out to a bunch of companies that were largely, some of them were large consulting companies that developed new, branches to do job training. They didn't know what they were doing, but they ran the entire system. So, from my experience, it's the contracting out that was the fundamental cause of the problems that you sort of so well documented and described in your presentation.
That's wonderful. I mean, I think that probably resulted from the 98 law that eventually came out, right? Because the 94 one failed, but then they passed a law in 98. And it's fun.
Yeah.
I just mean, yeah, I could go on about this for a long time, but it's not very clear 94. It's a weird hybrid mix in 94 of like government spending and this one-stop privatized stuff. So
Yeah.
and Lily Geismer has a nice book on like how Clinton and these other new Democrats kind of bought into these private public partnerships and all that kind of stuff. So that's wonderful. Thank you very much for that perspective. And I know it encourages me to dig into that later when the law was actually passed and like how that was structured. I think it's probably a little bit different than the 94 bill, but I totally hear what you're saying. And it's very interesting.
And I'm not remembering which law, right now, which law, happened when, but what I do know is I was there, we were implementing the programs in the state, all the states. And I know that it was a whole mind shift change that the private sector, it was, they put basically Clinton put Al Gore in charge of it. It was the NPR, the National Performance Standards came in too. It was performance standards, the NPR, and performance standards and privatization and contracting out. And, that's what our whole institutional capacity had to reorient ourselves towards. And so that was so fundamental to what happened then, whether it was, which law it was, I don't remember exactly.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. That's a great perspective.
Yeah. Thank you. And Les is next, and then it's Karina.
Yes, well, thanks for those insights about the role of innovation as, say, an ideological phrase in the US political system. There is an analogous story that has been told at great length about how that concept has played a central role in the European integration process, as it's sometimes called, or just in the European Union, where in the absence of anything to bind that process, innovation serves as a religious phrase, metaphorically speaking, and becomes a way of trying to evade politics, bypass political conflicts, at the same time as always justifying the same process that we heard in the USA of shifting resources and political power from the public sector to the private sector, promoting market incentives or simply believing in market incentives, which will bring about more eco-efficient innovations, which indirectly somehow will create more employment, reduce environmental pollution, et cetera, et cetera. There's a name for this. It's called ecological modernization, a theoretical framework which was elaborated initially by political scientists from the 1990s onwards, and it is ever more relevant today, encompassing a ever wider range of political issues. Now, climate change. I published a book on this last year called Beyond Climate Fixes, on how what I call a techno-market fix becomes the central principle for, well, all environmental problems. So whenever you hear the word innovation, we must immediately interrogate what this is supposed to mean, right? And what it obscures. And it obscures the political agendas which are being hidden, depoliticized by the employment of that term, and marginalizes public good innovations. in the double sense of diverting resources away from them and even making them invisible.
That was more a comment, which I quite like, making looking at the invisible innovations that are being obscured. Karina, you have lowered your hand, but you still want to join in. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks a lot for all the presentations. They were very interesting. And my question is more related to the presentation of Samuel and Ryan, I guess. So yeah, Samuel, I really like the way that you present this imagination and all this ontology for reality, looking at citizens, institutions, and physics. I was wondering, do you see a kind of in-between space where alternative imaginaries create a potential for new paradigm? Because after hearing all your presentation, I was wondering, is there a kind of mix of imaginaries, thinking in North and South? So perhaps you have, I don't know, some comments on that.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for the question. So the point is that, it seems to me that, before the works of, I have in mind Kuhn, I have in mind Feyerabend, there was this idea that, if you want to change a paradigm, you need to play on rationality, right? So you need to develop all of this logical reasoning, convincing all of the people that, this paradigm is not yet there or is not anymore there. And so you need a new paradigm, but all driven by rationality, right? And instead, after Kuhn and Feyerabend, so obviously, Feyerabend was very radical, was against the method, right? So I don't know if you read the book of Feyerabend Against the Method. So it's very radical in the sense that, according to him, all of these new technologies and new discoveries are driven by not only imagination, but irrationality. So you need to engage in irrationality in order to have, technological discoveries, et cetera, et cetera. I think my position, I would say that is very close to what you are proposing. So it's something in between, right? So it depends on which type of innovation you are talking about. So when we talk about radical innovations, I think that imagination is strongly necessary. So it's a necessary condition to have a radical innovation, regardless of any type of innovation. Could be related to science, but also to products, right? So if you want a radical innovation. When we talk about incremental innovations, in many cases, in my opinion, imagination is not necessary. Especially when you play with some incremental innovations, is more, a market validation, is more, a conversation with stakeholders. But I think that imagination is not always necessary. This is what I think, honestly. I don't know if I answer your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Ryan, did you want to? Because that was at least Karina's idea that you could, could have an answer. So I'm not sure.
I'm not sure how I would weigh on. I mean, Lee might have more to say about imaginaries than I might. I might just say that there's something about how, connecting to Lee's presentation, this idea, like the imaginary of the new economy, and the reality of kind of like, I would say I've been hanging around with the deindustrialization crew, and he kind of tipped at that during his presentation. Like the deindustrialization people as kind of social sciences have been pointing out, the deindustrialization was an enacted process, right? So part of what's happening at that like incremental innovation level is that some of the factories in North America are intentionally deciding, like, that for profit reasons, not to innovate, like not to adopt new technological processes that are necessary in order to keep their manufacturing operations profitable. And then blue collar worker, like everyday workers, get laid off because those companies can no longer compete. And there's some really good histories of kind of deindustrialization in particular places where one of the like key points in the story is a choice not to engage with incremental innovation. And at the same time, we've got this broader imaginary developing saying that, innovation is what's going to save us. And there's this real kind of difference between what's materially, as Lee's pointed out, what's materially happening on the ground in communities and what people are imagining to be happening in the economy and around innovation.
Okay, we have three more on the list. We have a good 15 minutes more, so we're not tied for time. Lee is first, then Pierre Benoit, and then Lucien.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of picks up. Well, the first thing I want to say is, Samuel, I think this is like too deep of a tension to really work out here, but I've been kind of developing a line of thought that's actually very critical of imagination as a kind of faculty. And I've been building on lots of different literatures. I pull it together in this little rant of mine called How to Be a Better Reactionary, which is kind of an anti-imagination manifesto. One of the things I build on is Max Horkheimer of the Frankfurt School was very critical of the imagination, including in Marcuse's hands. And Horkheimer, kind of building on neo-Kantian foundations, thought that that the imagination is a fundamentally conservative, in a certain sense, faculty, and that it's just shuffling around stuff that's already in our noggins. And so it can't really get us to anywhere like truly new. But I think part of the rub here is how you're kind of building on defining imagination versus what I'm playing with here. So maybe we can just follow up with each other later and kind of like talk through this, because I'm very interested in your perspective. My question is for Ryan, actually. So Ryan, I thought that you had a great talk to it, and I love the sprue part of this story. It's just so delicious for me. Like sprue is such a fascinating institution in this whole world. But I thought so. I was trained up in the engineering and public policy program at Carnegie Mellon, which is a very model heavy place. And I was in the history department studying the history of technology, but I was funded through them, and I was part of this climate change group I mentioned earlier. And those are very model heavy folks. They're not technological optimists, right? They all thought that like technologies could play some role, but we were probably going to have to shift our actions, right? And like do things less. And so, they were interested in using models. They were not techno-optimists. They were not the kind of sprue vision you're putting forward, but they were very critical of the limits to growth as like the way not to do this, right? And they would point out that like the limits to growth models got the dates just totally wrong, like this, and there for them it was like bad method basically is at the heart of what they're up to. So I just wondered, because I didn't hear that come out in your talk, because there's another way to criticize the limits to growth, which is not the kind of way you're identifying with, which I totally buy into your criticism of that. But yeah, so I just wanted to hear you kind of play through that for a second.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got all kinds of notes as I'm rereading Limits to Growth saying, oh my God, this method is so bad. Oh my God, like today, like population projections, I can do better population projections in Excel today than they were, with like they're not doing any work around like migration, or their population projections don't even look at like baby boom, like bubbles of population and demographic change. Like you can easily see through the limits of the method in both cases, right? I mean, this is the 1970s. People are just starting to use computers to do this kind of math. Part of what's going on here, right, underneath it all, materially in their research, is that they're all excited about this new technology, the computer, right? And like, oh, we can do proper, good social science now that we've all got computers. We can crunch the numbers the way we always wanted to crunch the numbers. And of course they can't, right? They can't, because they don't have all the numbers.
Right.
They can't see, like they're trying to see a whole system, but you can never see a whole system. And so there's like ontological and epistemological limits that are at play in what they're doing. And yeah, if you look at this from that climate change perspective, like everybody in the climate change environmental literature knows that method was problematic. The methods used in that book were problematic. Yeah. And yet most of the people who would criticize the method would still agree that the Earth has a finite capacity, right? And what happens in this methodological debate is that both camps end up with methods that are really substandard, right, by today's standards, but they end up really exposing kind of the values at the base, the kind of cultural values that are going to play out here over time. And one of those is they're arguing over the math, but what they're really getting at is this difference between how they think technology is going to play out, right? Or how change. And I should say that sprue at that point isn't really just using the word technology, right? They're also talking about social change. So there's some point later on where Sprue becomes, for a period of time anyway, increasingly focused on the technology part of innovation. And that hasn't quite happened yet in their work on the limits to growth. So yeah, yes, Lee, the math is pretty bad in limits to growth, and rightfully criticized. I'm interested in how that criticism is playing out.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also, thank you very much for pointing out again the computer excitement of the early 1970s, which we now have again. It's like with also computational social science, and now we have the better computers, and now it'll all work out. So it's just great traveling back to the 70s. But Pierre Benoit is next.
Okay, thanks, Cornelius. Thanks so much for this wonderful session. It's very inspiring, and I guess that perhaps there's an idea of a special issue of NOvation, which would draw on this for designing an agenda of research on these issues, because we see that we can tackle it from very different ways. But my question, I have a question to Samuele and another to that's very different. Samuele, well, it was very inspiring, but I wonder whether you discuss or you interact with innovative design, because in a way, innovative design, they have the same objective with very different practices, background, and so on. I think my colleagues they call them in actual veil, the theory knowledge concept, where they consider that to think differently, you have to provide interaction between these two sets. So did you look at that? And to less very nice stories, but if we consider that in terms of transition, we can say, okay, they are something occurring in niches, but what is the future of that? What does alternative means? Is it just niches, or is it some way? How do you see the scaling up process, or the transformation of the dominant regime? So, what is the story beyond what you tell to us?
Yeah, I would, I would answer by dividing your question into parts. So the initial part is about, design and innovative design, and the second part instead is about, the future and the evolution of the phenomenon. So the first part is about, my background. So my background is in engineering. And when I was at Politecnico di Milano, who is my home institution, basically the university was divided in two parts, so engineering and design. And design were classified as the enemies of engineers. but instead, I think that, innovative design is a very nice discipline, and is necessary today to understand, all of these topics. The point is that, I think that, when I talk with innovative designers, I discuss with them. I think that, they provide a lot of information, a lot of knowledge to, to the role of imagination, innovation, etc., etc. But I think that there is a puzzle between the difference between imagination and creativity. So the point is also, if you look at the managerial theories of organizational creativity. So creativity, and if you look, for instance, given that we are discussing about technology and artificial intelligence, so artificial intelligence is fundamental today in industrial design, in innovation design, and also in organizational creativity. But I think that imagination comes first. So imagination is before creativity. So imagination is the origin, to some extent, is the original act. And then, imagination is a kind of, necessary condition to start a creative process. So even if you look at, for instance, theories of, extended mind, for instance, so artificial intelligence is a tool that you can use in creativity. I totally agree with this. But I think that, there is still place for, human imagination to start the process, right? And the starting point is the conscience, the human conscience. I think that this is the idea, just to, put together, what I'm saying in my speech, and all of the knowledge about design. Talking about the future instead, it's a matter of, the cognitive process and the cognition in general. So I think that, back in the days, cognition was, a process all in the hands of humans. And instead now, there is an interaction between, human and the machine, in the sense that, you start with imagination and with, the generation of some ideas. But in this imagination process, when you need to retrieve some data, retrieve some, information, etc., you can use the machine. Then the processing of information is a kind of, augmenting process, right? So it is done by the human and the machine. And then in the final part of the process, especially for the validation of the ideas, for the realization of the ideas, to some extent, under certain conditions, you can easily delegate the process to the machine. So I think that, in the future, the role of the human will be more on the origin of the process. And instead, the machine will, to some extent, will replace many parts of the cognitive process. This is what I think, but, I may be totally wrong. But thanks so much for the question.
Yeah. Les?
Yes. Yeah, Pierre Bernard raises a difficult question. How these alternatives could move beyond the current niche. To some extent, they can expand if they have the appropriate support measures, from public authorities. I mean, that depends on a political struggle in itself, how to achieve those greater support measures. But sooner or later, it's meant to be a means to change the dominant system, or at least to reduce the harms, including the environmental harms. And that depends on a political confrontation. I mean, we can see this now happening in Brazil. I mean, 2 years after the new Lula government was elected, but with a much weaker left-wing base than it did in 2003, there are pressures to relaunch the agroecology programs at the same time as the advocates say, well, this would just be deceptive because the agro industry, called agro-negocio, agribusiness there, is still increasing the use of pesticides. It's the highest usage of pesticides per unit land in the whole world, including pesticides that are banned by the European Union. So there are now, conflicts over the demands to ban those, at least to conform with the EU standards, as the proper basis for any agenda that would significantly expand agroecological methods. And this conflict is possible because the alternatives built a political base alongside an economic, social alternative. So that's really the task, to combine all aspects of the alternative into a stronger political force.
Yes, thank you. We have a little more over 5 minutes. We have one last question by Lucien. I also have a question, but if anybody from the audience has a question, I'm happy to have that. But Lucien first.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Cornelius. And thank you also to all the panel speakers for this wonderful panel. When Tiago and I put this panel together, we have to confess we had a bit of the same reservation as Lee mentioned. Will this all fit together? But we had to sort of take into account also availability and logistics. But in the end, I'm really happy to see the presentations, how they did well connect, and also the discussion afterwards. So just a note of appreciation, and I guess also reflective of the nature of NOvation, which of course is very interdisciplinary. My question goes back to the nature of imagination, and I guess this question is in first instance to Samuele, but maybe also I'm curious to learn more about Lee's perspective on how imagination can be considered conservative. I think that's an interesting point, or I'll have to read that link that you shared in the chat. But I guess it's a bit of a reiteration also of Karina's question. In the same way as Kant's universal sort of view on rationality can be questioned, is rationality the same everywhere? My question is whether irrationality, as Samuele mentioned, is also different and not necessarily universal. And in that sense, is imagination something that's universally shared, or also very individual and different according to perhaps regions? I think if Karina mentioned, if I understood correctly, about is imagination different depending on the region we are in. So I guess I'm diving a little bit more further into really the nature of imagination, and whether this is also really an individual faculty, and because it feels like it's presented as such, but is it, or could it also be much more of a collective and shared faculty? So it's a bit of a
Lucian,
philosophical question.
no, absolutely, Lucian. Thank you so much for the question. So, just to be brief, so I don't believe in this dichotomy between, rationality and imagination. So sometimes, to imagine, you also use rationality. You use, for instance, I have in mind, the geometrical figures, right? So sometimes you use geometrical figures in order to develop new ideas. Geometrical figures is something that is, at least in my mind, is very, very rational. So I think that, rationality and imaginations are two parts of a process. So imagine in your imagination journey, you also use some rational figures, you use numbers, you use, other analytical tools. This is what I believe. About the subjectivity of imagination, I think that now there are a lot of processes. So, for instance, in innovation design, but also in innovation collaborations, in which we co-create something new, right? So we co-create new products, new services, etc., etc. But for instance, if you have in mind some experiments done in firms or also in labs at universities. In the process, the contribution to imagination is individual. So you provide a piece constructed by your own imagination, and this piece serves to continue the process to create something. So even during collaborations, I think that the pure imagination remains inherently subjective, but then it's shared. And I think that when you share your imagination, I think that this is probably the most difficult part, because you need to explain what you mean or what you have in mind. This is very, very complicated sometimes, right? Especially when you have very radical ideas. I have in mind, one of my favorite writers that is with Philip Dick. So in Philip Dick's books, you have a lot of, super strange ideas, and he was able to translate into objective terms those ideas, right? And then they will be shared by other authors, right? But I think that this communication part is what you have in mind. I think so. It what transforms a subjective piece of imagination into something that is collective. And this is, the necessary condition to then produce the real innovation. I think this is my idea.
Okay, and now coming to a close, we have a last question or comment or words of farewell by Tiago.
Yes, I'm not sure if you have a final question, Cornelius. I don't want to interrupt you. It's just a final
I do
say
have
for
one,
me.
but it's too big. We don't have time for that.
Okay, let's leave that for another occasion then. Well, guys, thank you very much. I would like to thank you all on behalf of the organization and NOvation colleagues, our team, right, as Lee mentioned. It was very interesting, very strong panel, guys. Thank you very much. And it was an interesting example of how it is possible to build up the ideas of NOvation Network. And this allows us kind of work of convergence between research agendas, and it allows us for colleagues in Brazil and South America to access the global north critical thinking. So this is very interesting, and to build up bridges with colleagues here in Brazil and South America. Despite Lee's critical view of discourse analysis, I think his denouncing of the innovation speak of our era is really important for from an analytical perspective. I loved all the presentations, and I do endorse our colleague Jolie's suggestion of preparing, right, Cornelius, a special issue for NOvation. We have different possibilities, so let us stay put, keep in touch, and see the opportunities of doing things together. Cornelius could be right. You could be like lead here an interesting thematic issue or some kind of collective proposal. I think this was very, very promising session here.
Yes. I think it was too. It was a great pleasure of having the opportunity to moderate that panel. I've written down several pages. My head is full of ideas, and so thank you very, very much for that. Whereas I will slowly sail off in the afternoon. To all those who've just gotten up, have a great day ahead of you. And thank you all very much. And I hope to see you at some other event location. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Obrigado.
Bye.
Thank you.